The furnace that Heinrich Mueller built in the center of his Wisconsin cabin looked wrong to everyone who saw it. It was enormous, taking up nearly a quarter of the living space in a 16 by 20-foot structure. It was made entirely of stone and clay, weighing an estimated 8 tons. It had a firebox the size of a bread box, far too small for the brutal Wisconsin winters. And strangest of all, it had walls that were 2 feet thick, massive slabs of fieldstone and river rock mortared together with a clay mixture that Heinrich had spent weeks perfecting. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. Jakob Schmidt, whose farm adjoined Heinrich's to the south, stopped by in October 1888 to see the construction. He stood in the doorway, staring at the massive stone structure, and shook his head slowly. "Mueller, this is madness. You've built a monument in your cabin. How are you supposed to live around this thing?" Heinrich was carefully placing another stone, tapping it into position with a wooden mallet. He didn't look up. "I live around it by staying warm." "But it's taking up all your space. And that firebox, Heinrich, it's tiny. You'll never keep a fire big enough in there to heat anything. You need a proper fireplace. Big firebox, good draw. What you've built is a stone oven that will eat your wood and give you nothing." Heinrich set down his mallet and turned to face Jakob. "What I've built is a heat battery. I burn a small hot fire for 2 hours. The stone absorbs the heat. Then the stone releases that heat slowly for the next 20 hours. I heat once a day and stay warm all day." Jakob laughed, not unkindly but with genuine amusement. "Heinrich, stone doesn't hold heat that long. It gets hot, sure, but then it cools down. Everyone knows that. You've wasted 3 months building this monster. Come spring, when you realize it doesn't work, you're going to have to tear it all out and build a proper fireplace like the rest of us." Other neighbors had similar reactions. The German immigrant who'd arrived 2 years earlier and was building strange things in his cabin. First, it was the triple-thick walls with sawdust insulation, which people thought was excessive. Then it was the raised floor with the root cellar underneath, which seemed like unnecessary work. And now this, a stone furnace that defied all common sense. The word spread through the small farming community near Lake Geneva. Mueller's building a stone monster, taking up half his cabin, thinks it'll heat better than a regular fireplace. Poor fool will freeze this winter. Some people felt sorry for Heinrich. He was unmarried, living alone, trying to prove up his claim on 80 acres of marginal farmland. Winter was coming, and he'd just spent his time and resources on a furnace that obviously wouldn't work. Others were less sympathetic. If a man was foolish enough to ignore conventional wisdom, he'd learn his lesson the hard way. That's how the frontier worked. You made mistakes. You paid for them. You either learned or you left. Heinrich ignored all of it. He continued building. He'd started the furnace in August, laying the foundation of flat stones set deep into the earth below the cabin floor. Then he'd built up the walls, course by course, each stone carefully selected for size and shape. The interior of the furnace was a maze of channels. Hot air from the firebox rose through vertical channels in the walls, then traveled horizontally through channels near the top, then descended through more channels before finally exiting through the chimney. The path the hot air took through the stone mass was over 30 feet long. Every inch of that path allowed heat to transfer from the air into the stone. By the time the smoke reached the chimney, it was barely warm. All the heat had been extracted and stored in the 8-ton mass of stone. This was not Heinrich's invention. He was building what was called a grundofen in his native Germany, or what the Russians called a masonry heater. These massive stone furnaces had been heating homes in northern and eastern Europe for centuries. They were standard construction in places where winters were long, firewood was expensive, and efficiency mattered. But in America, particularly on the frontier, they were virtually unknown. American settlers built fireplaces, open fireplaces with large fireboxes and straight chimneys. These fireplaces were simple to build, easy to operate, and worked adequately in most conditions. Their efficiency was terrible. Roughly 90% of the heat went straight up the chimney. But firewood was abundant, so efficiency didn't matter much. You just burned more wood. Heinrich had grown up in Bavaria, in a stone cottage heated by a grundofen that his great-grandfather had built. He remembered the warmth. His family would fire the furnace every morning for about 2 hours, burning small, hot fires that consumed relatively little wood. The stone would absorb the heat, and the house would stay warm all day and well into the night. In the coldest weather, they might fire it twice a day, morning and evening. But even then, they used less wood than their neighbors with conventional fireplaces. When Heinrich emigrated to America in 1886, he brought that knowledge with him. He knew how a grundofen worked, he knew how to build one, and he knew that in the Wisconsin winters, which could be every bit as cold as Bavaria, a masonry heater would be far superior to an open fireplace. But knowledge and execution are different things. Building a grundofen required skills that Heinrich possessed, but most American builders didn't. You needed to understand how to create the internal channels, how to ensure proper draft, how to proportion the firebox to the stone mass, how to select and place stones for maximum heat retention, how to mix mortar that could withstand repeated heating and cooling cycles without cracking. It was complex, it was time-consuming. And to someone unfamiliar with the concept, it looked completely wrong. The firebox was the most controversial element. Heinrich had built it small deliberately. The opening was only 12 inches wide and 14 inches tall. The internal chamber was perhaps 18 inches deep. You couldn't fit large logs in there. You couldn't build the roaring fires that most people associated with warmth. Jakob Schmidt wasn't the only neighbor who pointed this out. How are you going to burn enough wood in that tiny box to heat anything? The question was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how the grundofen worked. American fireplaces were designed for large, slow-burning fires. You loaded them up with big logs, let them burn for hours, and they produced steady heat. The problem was that most of that heat went up the chimney. The grundofen worked on a completely different principle. You built small, intensely hot fires. Small pieces of wood, no thicker than your wrist, packed tightly in the firebox, burned with maximum airflow. The goal was to achieve complete combustion, burning the wood so thoroughly that almost no smoke remained. Just heat, intense heat. That heat rose through the channels in the stone walls, transferring its energy to the massive stone mass. The stone heated up, sometimes to over 200 degrees Fahrenheit on the interior surfaces. Then, when the fire burned out, the stone began releasing that stored heat. Slowly, steadily, for 20 to 24 hours. It was thermal mass storage, the same principle that Jonas Fletcher had used with his stone fireplace in Wyoming, but taken to an extreme. 8 tons of stone, all of it heated, all of it radiating warmth into the living space. Heinrich finished the grundofen in early November 1888. The structure stood 7 feet tall, with its top surface level with the cabin's ceiling. The walls were 2 feet thick on all sides. The exterior surface was smooth river rock, carefully selected for appearance and heat radiation properties. There were 3 benches built into the structure, stone seats covered with clay tiles that would become pleasantly warm to sit on. The firebox opening faced the main living area with a heavy iron door that could be closed to control airflow. The chimney rose another 4 feet above the roof peak, with a damper that could be adjusted to fine-tune the draft. Total construction time, 3 months. Total cost, essentially free, since all the materials were gathered from Heinrich's own land. Total weight, approximately 8 tons, supported by the reinforced foundation Heinrich had built specifically for this purpose. He lit the first fire on November 7, 1888, small pieces of split oak stacked loosely in the firebox to allow maximum airflow. He left the door open and the damper fully open. The wood caught quickly, burning with a hot, clean flame. Within 20 minutes, the fire was roaring, flames filling the small firebox. Heinrich fed it steadily for 2 hours, adding small pieces as the previous ones were consumed. The stone began to warm. He could feel it with his hand, the surface temperature rising gradually. After 2 hours, the firebox was full of glowing coals. Heinrich closed the damper partially, reducing the airflow, He let the coals burn down for another 30 minutes until nothing remained but ash. Then he closed the iron door and shut the damper almost completely, leaving just enough opening for residual gases to escape. The firebox was empty, the fire was out, and the cabin was warming up. By late afternoon, the exterior surface of the grundofen was warm to the touch. Not hot enough to burn, but noticeably warm. The air temperature in the cabin rose steadily. By evening, it was comfortable. By night, it was actually warm. Heinrich could walk around in his shirt sleeves. He went to bed without needing multiple blankets. When he woke the next morning, the cabin was still warm. The grundofen's surface was still radiating heat. He checked the interior temperature with his hand through a small inspection port he'd built into the structure. The stone inside was still very hot. He didn't need to light another fire until late morning. He ran the same routine. Small, hot fire for 2 hours, let it burn to coals, close everything up. The cabin stayed warm for another 24 hours. Over the next 2 weeks, Heinrich refined his technique. He learned exactly how much wood to use, how to stack it for optimal burning, when to close the damper, how to adjust for outdoor temperature. By late November, he had the system perfected. 1 firing per day in mild weather, 2 firings per day, morning and evening, when temperatures dropped below zero. The grundofen performed exactly as he'd expected. The wood consumption was remarkably low. Heinrich estimated he was using about 1/4 the firewood that his neighbors were burning in their conventional fireplaces. The cabin stayed consistently warm. No cold spots, no drafts, just steady, even warmth radiating from the 8-ton mass of stone in the center of his home. But his neighbors remained skeptical. They hadn't seen it in operation. They'd heard Heinrich's claims, but claims were just words. They figured he was probably supplementing with a smaller stove he wasn't mentioning, or maybe the weather just hadn't been cold enough yet to prove the grundofen's inadequacy. The real test would come when serious cold arrived. That test came in January 1889. A high-pressure system settled over Wisconsin in early January, bringing clear skies and plummeting temperatures. On January 9th, the temperature dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. On January 10th, -25. On January 11th, -30. The cold was severe but not unprecedented. People stayed inside, burned wood constantly, and waited for it to break. Then the snow started. January 12th brought the first flakes, light at first, then heavier. By evening, it was a full blizzard, wind howling out of the northwest at 40 miles per hour. Snow so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. Temperature holding steady at -28 degrees. The blizzard continued through the night. January 13th dawned gray and white, the snow still falling, the wind still screaming. The storm showed no signs of stopping. By January 14th, 3 days into the blizzard, people were getting concerned. The snow was already 3 feet deep in the open areas, drifted to 10 or 15 feet in the lee of buildings. The temperature hadn't risen above -25, the wind hadn't stopped, and the snow kept falling. Jakob Schmidt tried to reach his barn to check on his livestock on the morning of January 14th. He got 20 feet from his house before the wind and cold drove him back. He couldn't see the barn, he couldn't feel his face. He retreated to his house where his wife and 3 children huddled by the fireplace. They were burning wood as fast as Jakob could split it, and the house was still cold. The fireplace roared constantly, but the heat went straight up the chimney. The stone around the firebox was warm, but that warmth didn't extend far into the room. The family wore all their winter clothes indoors. They slept in shifts, someone always awake to tend the fire. If the fire went out, the house would become uninhabitable within hours. Other families faced similar conditions. The Johnsons, half a mile north of Hinrich. The Andersons, a mile to the west. The Kowalskis, 2 miles east. Every family burning wood desperately, fighting to stay warm, watching their wood piles shrink at alarming rates, and wondering how long the storm would last. January 15th, day 4, still snowing. Still -20 or colder. Still wind. Heinrich Mueller fired his grundofen twice that day, Morning and evening. Total burn time, 4 hours. Wood used, approximately 1/8 of a cord. His cabin stayed at a comfortable 60 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the day and night. He cooked his meals on the flat-top surface of the grundofen, which was hot enough to boil water. He sat on the stone benches reading. He slept comfortably with a single blanket. The storm outside was irrelevant to him. His 8 tons of stone had stored enough heat to keep him warm regardless of what nature threw at the cabin. January 16th, day 5. The storm intensified. Wind speeds increased to 50 miles per hour. The temperature dropped to -32 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest reading in the area in over a decade. Snow was now 4 feet deep on the level ground, with drifts reaching 20 feet. No one could leave their homes. Travel was impossible. Visibility was zero, and every family was burning through their wood supplies at unsustainable rates. The Schmidt family was in trouble. Jakob had a large wood pile, but he hadn't anticipated burning wood at this rate for this long. By his calculation, he had maybe 3 more days of fuel. Then what? He couldn't get to the woods to cut more. He couldn't even get to his barn. The family was trapped in their house, burning their survival away cord by cord. Other families faced similar math. The Johnsons had less wood than the Schmidts. The Andersons had been burning furniture. The Kowalskis were rationing, letting their fire burn low overnight and shivering under piles of blankets. January 17th, day 6, still no break in the weather. The temperature had dropped to -35 degrees. The snow was still falling. The wind was still howling, and people were starting to panic. Jakob Schmidt made a decision. He couldn't stay in his house. His wood would run out. His family would freeze. He needed help. The nearest neighbor was Heinrich Mueller. Jakob knew that Heinrich's cabin was only about 200 yards away, though in the current conditions it might as well have been 2 miles. But he had no choice. He bundled up in every piece of clothing he owned. He tied a rope around his waist, tied the other end to his front door, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The wind nearly knocked him over. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't see. He staggered forward, following his instincts, praying he was going in the right direction. He fell twice, the snow so deep he sank to his chest. He got up, kept moving, fell again, kept moving. He had no idea if he was going the right way. He had no idea how far he'd gone. He was completely disoriented, lost in a white void of wind and snow and cold. Then he saw a shape, dark against the white. A building. He staggered toward it. It was Heinrich's cabin. Jakob nearly wept with relief. He pounded on the door. Heinrich opened it immediately, pulled Jakob inside, and shut the door against the storm. The first thing Jakob noticed was the warmth. The cabin was warm. Not just bearable, but actually warm. He could feel his frozen face starting to thaw, the painful tingling of returning circulation. He looked around, confused. Where was the fire? There was no fire visible. The firebox door on the grundofen was closed. No flames, no smoke, just the massive stone structure radiating heat like a living thing. "How?" Jakob managed to say through his frozen beard. "How is it so warm in here? You don't even have a fire going." Heinrich helped Jakob out of his frozen outer clothes and sat him on one of the stone benches. The warmth from the stone soaked into Jakob's body. "I fired it this morning. 3 hours ago. The stone is still releasing the heat. It will stay warm until tomorrow morning. Then I'll fire it again." Jakob stared at the grundofen, understanding finally breaking through his skepticism. This wasn't a monument or a folly. This was survival technology. This was 8 tons of stored heat that didn't require constant feeding, constant attention, constant burning. This was what Heinrich had been trying to tell them all along. "My family," Jakob said, "we're out of wood, maybe 3 days left, and this storm isn't breaking." Heinrich nodded. "Bring them here. We can all fit. The grundofen will keep us all warm." "I can't get back. I almost died getting here. I can't find my house in this." Heinrich went to his door and opened it. The storm was still raging, but he pulled out a large coil of rope. I brought this from Bavaria. Always keep rope for winter. We tie this to my door. You hold on, you follow it back to your house. Then you and your family follow it back here. The rope doesn't lie. It will bring you straight back. Jakob made the return journey using the rope as a lifeline. He found his way back to his house, miraculous as it seemed. He explained the situation to his wife. They bundled up the children, gathered what supplies they could carry, and made the journey back to Heinrich's cabin following the rope. The entire Schmidt family, 5 people total, crowded into Heinrich's 16 by 20-foot cabin, and the grundofen kept them all warm. Heinrich fired it twice a day. The stone absorbed the heat. The stone radiated the heat. The cabin stayed at a comfortable temperature. 5 people, a howling blizzard outside, temperatures at minus 35 degrees, and they were warm. Jakob couldn't believe it. He'd been skeptical. He'd mocked Heinrich. He'd been completely wrong. January 18th, day 7. The storm continued. Heinrich's cabin now sheltered not just the Schmidt family but also the Johnson family, who'd followed the same rope lifeline after Jakob sent word they could find refuge. 9 people in a 16 by 20-foot cabin. Tight quarters, but warm. The grundofen performed flawlessly. Heinrich adjusted his firing schedule, running 3 fires per day instead of 2 to compensate for the additional body heat load and the door opening more frequently. The cabin temperature stayed steady. Everyone was comfortable. Outside, the storm raged on. The temperature held at minus 30 to minus 35. The snow kept falling. The wind kept blowing. Inside Heinrich's cabin, people sat on stone benches and marveled. They'd spent years building fireplaces the conventional way, and those fireplaces couldn't keep them warm in a serious storm. Heinrich had spent 3 months building something everyone thought was crazy, and it was keeping 9 people alive in the worst weather they'd ever seen. If you're watching this and realizing that old knowledge sometimes beats new methods, that proven techniques from other cultures might be exactly what we need, then subscribe to this channel. We're diving deep into forgotten survival wisdom and practical skills that still work today. Hit that subscribe button and let's keep learning together. Now let's continue with how this 10-day blizzard changed everyone's mind about Heinrich's stone furnace. January 19th, day 8. The storm finally began to weaken. The snow was still falling, but lighter now. The wind was still blowing, but not as violently. The temperature remained brutally cold, minus 30 degrees, but at least it wasn't getting colder. People began to hope that the worst was over. January 20th, day 9. The snow stopped. The wind died down to occasional gusts. The temperature started to rise, slowly. It was still minus 25, still dangerous, still prohibitive for travel. But the storm was breaking. January 21st, day 10. Clear skies. Temperature rising to minus 15 degrees. Still cold, but after 10 days of minus 30 or worse, it felt almost mild. The storm was over. The Schmidt and Johnson families prepared to return to their homes. Jakob pulled Heinrich aside before leaving. "I owe you an apology. I called you a fool. I laughed at your furnace. I was wrong about everything." Heinrich shook his head. "You weren't wrong to be skeptical. The grundofen is strange to American eyes, but now you've seen it work. Now you know." "I want to build one," Jakob said. "Next summer. Will you help me?" "Of course. And I'll help anyone else who wants to learn." Word of what happened during the 10-day blizzard spread quickly through the community. Heinrich's strange stone furnace had kept 9 people warm while conventional fireplaces struggled to keep single families from freezing. The efficiency was undeniable. The reliability was proven. The technique was validated. By late February, Heinrich had requests from 7 families who wanted to build grundofens in their homes. He agreed to help all of them with one condition. They had to help each other. Building a grundofen required labor, skill, and time. It couldn't be done quickly, but if everyone worked together, sharing labor and knowledge, they could build one furnace at a time throughout the next summer and fall. Everyone agreed. The collaborative building project started in May 1889. Heinrich designed each furnace specifically for the home it would occupy, adjusting the size and configuration based on the dimensions of the cabin and the needs of the family. The basic principles remain the same: large thermal mass, small, efficient firebox, maze of internal channels to extract maximum heat from the fire, thick walls to store and slowly release that heat. The first grundofen was built in Jakob Schmidt's cabin. It took 6 weeks with multiple families contributing labor. The stone gathering alone took 2 weeks. The construction required careful attention to detail. The internal channels had to be built precisely. The mortar had to be mixed correctly. The stones had to be selected and placed for optimal heat retention and radiation. It was slow work, painstaking work, but everyone could see the value. They'd experienced Heinrich's grundofen during the blizzard. They knew this wasn't a waste of time. By November 1889, 4 families had grundofens installed. By November 1890, all 7 families had them. The winter of 1890 to 1891 was cold, but not extraordinary. The grundofens performed as expected. Families burned a fraction of the wood they'd used in previous years. Homes stayed consistently warm. The comfort level was dramatically higher than with conventional fireplaces. People who'd been skeptical became believers. But the real validation came in January 1893, when another major blizzard hit Wisconsin. This storm lasted 6 days, with temperatures dropping to -28 degrees and snow accumulating to 3 feet. Every family with a grundofen weathered the storm easily. They fired their furnaces twice a day. They stayed warm. They used minimal firewood. Meanwhile, families who still relied on conventional fireplaces struggled. They burned wood constantly. They battled cold spots and drafts. They went through their wood supplies at alarming rates. The contrast was stark and undeniable. The grundofen was superior, not by a small margin, but by a revolutionary margin. It was a different category of heating technology, more efficient, more comfortable, more reliable, and more economical in terms of fuel consumption. By the mid-1890s, the technique had spread beyond Heinrich's immediate community. Other settlers in Wisconsin heard about the grundofens and came to see them in operation. Some hired Heinrich as a consultant to design and build furnaces for them. Others learned from the families who already had them and built their own. The knowledge spread organically, person to person, community to community. Heinrich Mueller became something of a local expert on masonry heaters. He never charged for his advice, though he accepted payment for his labor when he helped build furnaces. He considered it his responsibility to share knowledge that had been passed down through generations in his family. By 1900, there were over 30 grundofens operating in the Lake Geneva area, each one a testament to the principle that thermal mass storage is more efficient than direct burning. Each one a reminder that old world knowledge, brought to the new world, could solve new world problems. The science behind why grundofens work so well is straightforward, though it wasn't fully understood in the 1880s. It comes down to combustion efficiency and thermal mass storage. A conventional fireplace burns wood inefficiently. The wood burns at moderate temperatures with incomplete combustion. Much of the energy in the wood is lost as unburned gases and particulates that go up the chimney as smoke. Additionally, the open design of a fireplace allows room air to be pulled into the firebox and sent up the chimney, carrying heat with it. The result is that only 10 to 20% of the wood's energy heats the room. The rest is wasted. A grundofen, by contrast, achieves nearly complete combustion. The small, hot fire burns at very high temperatures with maximum airflow. The wood burns completely, releasing all its available energy as heat. Very little smoke is produced because very little unburned material remains. All that heat rises into the stone mass, where it's captured. The long path through the internal channels ensures that almost all the heat transfers from the hot air to the stone before exiting through the chimney. The efficiency is typically 75 to 85%. That means 75 to 85% of the wood's energy ends up heating the home. Compare that to the 10 to 20% efficiency of a conventional fireplace, and you understand why a grundofen uses 1/4 to 1/5 the firewood. The thermal mass storage is the second critical factor. Stone is an excellent material for thermal mass because it's dense, it's abundant, and it has good heat capacity. Heat capacity is a measure of how much energy it takes to raise the temperature of a material. Stone has a heat capacity of about 0.2 calories per gram per degree Celsius. That might not sound like much, but when you have 8 tons of stone, 16,000 pounds, the numbers become impressive. Heating 8 tons of stone by 100 degrees. Fahrenheit requires storing approximately 900,000 BTUs of energy. That's the equivalent of burning about 15 pounds of dry hardwood. And that stored energy is then released slowly over 20 to 24 hours. The release rate is controlled by the surface area of the stone and the temperature differential between the stone and the room air. As the stone cools, it radiates heat. As the room air warms, the temperature differential decreases and the radiation rate slows. The result is a long, slow release of heat that maintains a relatively constant temperature in the living space. This is fundamentally different from a fireplace, which provides intense heat while burning and no heat when not burning. The grundofen provides moderate, steady heat for extended periods. It's the difference between a sprint and a marathon. Modern masonry heaters, which are based on the same principles as the grundofen, have been studied extensively. Research has confirmed what Heinrich Mueller knew from experience. They're highly efficient. They produce very low emissions because of complete combustion. They provide comfortable, even heating. They use significantly less firewood than conventional wood stoves or fireplaces, and they can last for generations with minimal maintenance. Some grundofens built in Europe in the 1700s are still in operation today. The main drawback is the initial construction cost and complexity. Building a masonry heater requires skill, time, and materials. It's not a project for someone without building experience. It requires understanding of masonry, heat dynamics, and structural engineering. This is why they never became widespread in America. The frontier favored quick, simple solutions. Fireplaces were easy. Any settler with basic skills could build one. Grundofens required expertise. But for those willing to invest the time and effort, the payoff was substantial. Heinrich lived in his cabin until 1912, when he sold the property and moved to Milwaukee to live with his daughter's family. The cabin with its grundofen was occupied continuously for the next 40 years. Each successive owner marveled at the heating efficiency. The furnace required no modifications and no repairs. It worked as well in 1950 as it had in 1888. In 1953, the cabin was torn down to make way for a modern house. The new owners considered trying to preserve the grundofen, but the structure was so integral to the cabin that removing it would have damaged it. The 8 tons of stone were broken up and used as fill. The knowledge of how to build it, however, survived. Several of the families who'd learned from Heinrich passed the knowledge to their children. A few grundofens built in the 1890s still existed in the area. And the story of Heinrich's furnace keeping 9 people warm during the 10-day blizzard became a local legend, repeated and embellished over generations. In the 1970s, during the energy crisis, there was renewed interest in efficient wood heating. People began researching masonry heaters, discovering that they were far superior to conventional fireplaces and even better than most metal wood stoves. The Finnish tulikivis, the Austrian grundofens, the Russian masonry stoves, all variations on the same theme: thermal mass storage, high-efficiency combustion, long burn cycles. Several companies began manufacturing prefabricated masonry heater kits. Builders began offering custom masonry heaters as an option for new homes. The old technology was rediscovered and reappreciated. Today, masonry heaters are recognized as one of the most efficient and environmentally friendly ways to heat with wood. The EPA has studied them and confirmed their low emissions. Efficiency ratings of 75 to 90% are standard. Some designs achieve over 90% efficiency. They're particularly popular in cold climate regions where heating costs are high and environmental concerns are important. The principles that Heinrich Mueller brought from Bavaria to Wisconsin in the 1880s are now backed by modern science, validated by modern testing, and incorporated into modern building codes. But the core concept hasn't changed. Burn small, hot, clean fires. Capture the heat in thermal mass. Release that heat slowly. The mathematics of thermal mass storage are elegant. The specific heat capacity of stone is approximately 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. If you have 16,000 pounds of stone, an 8-ton grundofen, and you heat it by 100 degrees Fahrenheit, you've stored 320,000 BTUs of energy. That's roughly equivalent to burning 10 pounds of hardwood. If that heat is released over 24 hours, the average heat output is about 13,300 BTUs per hour. That's enough to heat a moderately insulated 1,500 square foot home in cold weather. With 2 firings per day in extreme cold, you double the heat output, all from small, efficient fires that consume minimal wood and produce minimal emissions. The contrast with conventional fireplaces becomes even more stark when you consider air quality. A conventional fireplace produces significant smoke because of incomplete combustion. That smoke contains particulates, carbon monoxide, and unburned hydrocarbons. It's unhealthy for the people in the home and unhealthy for the environment. A properly fired grundofen produces almost no visible smoke. The high-temperature combustion burns the wood so completely that very little particulate matter remains. The emissions are primarily carbon dioxide and water vapor, the same things produced by complete combustion of any carbon-based fuel. This wasn't something Heinrich thought about in terms of air quality, but he noticed it. His chimney required cleaning once a year. His neighbors with conventional fireplaces cleaned their chimneys 2 or 3 times a year because of creosote buildup. Less smoke meant less creosote. Less creosote meant less fire hazard. Another advantage Heinrich noticed immediately. The comfort level provided by a grundofen is also superior to conventional heating. Radiant heat from the large stone mass warms objects and people directly, not just the air. This is more comfortable than forced air heating, which heats the air but can leave you feeling cold if you're not directly in the air stream. The surface temperature of a grundofen is typically 100 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit when it's actively radiating heat. That's warm enough to heat effectively, but not hot enough to burn on contact. The stone benches that Heinrich built into his furnace were a traditional feature of European grundofens. People would sit on them to warm up quickly. In some designs, the bench areas were built large enough to sleep on, providing a warm sleeping surface in the coldest weather. The thermal mass also provides temperature stability. In a house heated with a conventional fireplace, the temperature fluctuates significantly. It's hot near the fireplace, cold away from it. It's warm when the fire is burning, cold when it's not. The room temperature can swing 20 or 30 degrees over the course of a day. With a grundofen, the temperature is much more stable. The massive stone mass acts as a buffer, absorbing excess heat when the fire is burning and releasing it when the fire is out. The result is a temperature that varies by maybe 5 to 10 degrees over a 24-hour period. This stability is more comfortable and healthier. Before we continue with the legacy of Heinrich's work and how it influenced modern heating, let me ask you something. If these stories of practical innovation and forgotten skills are valuable to you, then help this channel grow. Subscribe now so you don't miss future videos on survival techniques, building methods, and the wisdom our ancestors used to thrive in harsh conditions. Now let's look at what happened to the families who learned from Heinrich and how this knowledge spread. The families who built grundofens in the 1890s developed a tight-knit community. They helped each other with construction, shared firewood cutting duties, and compared notes on optimal burning techniques. This collaboration created a knowledge base that went beyond what any individual family could have developed. Jakob Schmidt, who'd been Heinrich's first skeptic and first convert, became an advocate for the technology. He helped design and build grundofens for other families in the region. By 1900, Jacob had participated in the construction of over 20 furnaces. He'd learned the nuances of sizing the firebox for different home sizes, of calculating the appropriate thermal mass, of designing the internal channels for optimal heat extraction. He'd become an expert in his own right. Other families made their own innovations. The Anderson family modified their grundofen to include a baking chamber, a separate space within the stone mass that could be used as an oven. The Johnson family built their grundofen with an integrated water heating system, running copper pipes through the stone mass to preheat water for washing and cooking. These modifications showed that the basic concept was adaptable. The principles remained the same, but the specific implementation could be customized for different needs. The economic impact of grundofens on these families was significant. Firewood was abundant in Wisconsin, but cutting, splitting, and hauling it was hard work. Time spent cutting wood was time not spent on other productive activities. By reducing firewood consumption by 75%, the grundofen freed up substantial time and labor. A family that had been cutting and hauling 30 cords of wood per winter now needed only 7 or 8 cords. That's the difference between spending 2 full months on firewood versus 2 or 3 weeks. The saved time could be used for other work, improving the farm, earning additional income, or simply resting. The health benefits were also notable. Homes heated with grundofens had more stable temperatures and better air quality. Respiratory problems, which were common in homes with smoky fireplaces, were less frequent. The warmer, more consistent indoor temperatures reduced stress on the body, particularly for children and elderly family members. These benefits were difficult to quantify, but families noticed them. People got sick less often in homes with grundofens. Children seemed healthier. Winter was still hard, but it was less brutal. The maintenance requirements for a grundofen were minimal. Once built, the structure required little upkeep. The firebox might need relined with fire brick every decade or so. The mortar joints might need repointing every 20 or 30 years. The chimney needed annual cleaning, like any wood-burning system. But compared to the constant repair and adjustment required by metal stoves, which could rust out or develop leaks, the grundofen was remarkably durable. Some of the furnaces built in the 1890s were still functioning in the 1950s and 60s. The stone construction meant they could last for generations with minimal care. This longevity made them an excellent investment. The initial construction cost was high in terms of time and labor, but the ongoing costs were minimal. Over the lifetime of the structure, a grundofen was far more economical than buying and replacing metal stoves. The cultural impact was also interesting. The families who adopted grundofens saw themselves as part of a tradition that connected them to Europe, to old world craftsmanship, to a way of building that emphasized quality and longevity over speed and convenience. This was particularly meaningful for immigrant families like Heinrich's, who were trying to preserve elements of their heritage while adapting to their new homeland. The grundofen became a symbol of that balance. It was European in origin but American in application. It represented the best of both worlds. The decline of grundofen construction in the early 20th century was driven by several factors. The availability of coal and later heating oil made wood burning less attractive. Central heating systems, first with coal furnaces and later with oil and gas, provided more convenience and required less labor. The move from rural homesteads to urban and suburban living meant fewer people had access to firewood. And the specialized knowledge required to build grundofens was not being passed to younger generations. By the 1930s and 40s, very few new grundofens were being built. The existing ones continued to function, but when families moved or homes were torn down, the furnaces were lost. The knowledge might have disappeared entirely if not for the energy crisis of the 1970s. When oil prices spiked and heating costs soared, people began looking for alternatives. Wood heating saw a resurgence. But most people turned to metal wood stoves, which were readily available and easy to install. A few people, however, began researching more efficient options. They discovered masonry heaters. They learned about the European tradition of grundofens, tulikivis, and Russian stoves. They read old books and articles about thermal mass heating, and they began building modern versions of these ancient designs. The modern masonry heater movement in America can be traced directly back to this period. Pioneers like Albie Barden and others began promoting masonry heaters, writing books, teaching workshops, and designing systems that combine traditional principles with modern materials and engineering. The Masonry Heater Association was founded in 1984 to promote the technology and establish standards. Today, there are hundreds of professional masonry heater builders in North America. The designs have been refined and improved. Modern materials like refractory concrete and high-temperature insulation allow for more efficient heat transfer. Computer modeling helps optimize the internal channel design, but the fundamental principle remains exactly what Heinrich Mueller built in his Wisconsin cabin in 1888. Large thermal mass, efficient combustion, slow heat release. The environmental benefits of masonry heaters are now well documented. A study by the Brookhaven National Laboratory found that masonry heaters produce 90% less particulate emissions than conventional fireplaces and 50% less than EPA-certified wood stoves. The high combustion temperatures and long burn times result in nearly complete burning of the wood, leaving very little ash and very few unburned gases. From a carbon footprint perspective, wood burning is considered carbon neutral if the wood is harvested sustainably. The carbon released during burning is the same carbon the tree absorbed during growth. Masonry heaters maximize the energy extracted from each piece of wood, making them one of the most environmentally responsible ways to use wood for heating. The efficiency also means less wood is needed, which reduces the environmental impact of harvesting. A family heating with a masonry heater might use 3 to 5 cords of wood per winter. The same family using a conventional fireplace might use 15 to 20 cords. That's a significant difference in terms of forest impact. The story of Heinrich Mueller and his stone wall furnace is ultimately a story about the value of traditional knowledge in solving modern problems. Heinrich didn't invent anything new. He brought a technology that was centuries old in Europe and applied it in a new context. But in doing so, he solved a real problem: how to heat a home efficiently and comfortably in a harsh climate with limited resources. His neighbors mocked him because they didn't understand. They saw his massive stone furnace and thought it was wasteful, excessive, a monument to foolishness. They couldn't imagine that something so different from what they knew could actually work better. But Heinrich was patient. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince. He just built his furnace and used it. When the 10-day blizzard arrived, when temperatures hit minus 35 degrees and stayed there for over a week, when conventional fireplaces couldn't keep people warm no matter how much wood they burned, Heinrich's grundofen proved itself. It kept 9 people warm. It used minimal firewood. It worked exactly as Heinrich had said it would. And in that moment, skepticism turned to understanding. The neighbors who'd mocked him asked to learn from him. The community that had dismissed his ideas embraced them. Within a few years, the strange stone furnace that everyone had ridiculed became the preferred heating method in the area. The validation of traditional knowledge over conventional wisdom. The triumph of physics over popularity. The proof that sometimes the old ways are old because they work, not because they're outdated. This pattern repeats throughout history. Someone brings knowledge from elsewhere, applies it in a new context, faces skepticism, proves it works, and changes how people think. Heinrich Mueller was part of that pattern. He wasn't a genius or an inventor. He was an immigrant who remembered how his family stayed warm in Bavaria and figured the same principles would work in Wisconsin. He was right, and his willingness to trust that knowledge, to build his 8-ton stone furnace despite the mockery, saved lives during the worst blizzard his community had seen. The legacy lives on in every modern masonry heater, in every home heated efficiently with wood, in every builder who understands that thermal mass storage is superior to direct burning. Heinrich Mueller's grundofen, built in 1888 in a Wisconsin cabin, demonstrated principles that are still being proven correct today. Everyone mocked his stone wall furnace. They called it a waste. They called it foolish. They called Heinrich a dreamer who'd freeze when winter came. Then it heated his home through a 10-day blizzard. Then it kept 9 people alive when conventional heating failed. Then it proved that the old world had solutions the new world hadn't even imagined. The mockery turned to respect. The folly revealed itself as wisdom. And a technology that had heated European homes for centuries found a new home in America. Not through advertising or promotion, but through performance, through surviving the kind of test that makes or breaks a technology, through being there when people needed it most. Heinrich Mueller's stone wall furnace stood for over 60 years. It heated multiple families. It required almost no maintenance. It worked as well on its last day as on its first. When it was finally demolished in 1953, the stones that came out of it were still sound. The design was still functional. It hadn't failed. It had simply been replaced by different technology, by systems that offered convenience at the cost of efficiency. But the knowledge didn't die. It persisted. It re-emerged. And today, people are building masonry heaters again, rediscovering what Heinrich knew all along. That 8 tons of stone, properly designed, can heat a home better than almost anything else. That small, hot fires are more efficient than large, slow ones. That thermal mass storage is the key to consistent comfort. That the old ways survive because they work. Heinrich would probably be surprised to learn that people are still talking about his furnace over. A century later, he was just trying to stay warm. He was just using the knowledge his family had passed down, but in doing so, he demonstrated something that we keep forgetting and rediscovering. The solutions to our problems often already exist. They're in the traditional knowledge of other cultures. They're in the techniques our ancestors developed. They're in the wisdom that seems strange until you understand the why behind it. Heinrich's neighbors thought his stone wall furnace was madness until they needed it. Then it was salvation. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. That's why the story matters. Because somewhere, right now, someone is building something that looks crazy. Something that challenges conventional wisdom. Something that uses old knowledge in new ways. And everyone is mocking them. Just like they mocked Heinrich. But maybe, just maybe, that person understands something the rest of us don't. Maybe that crazy idea is actually the solution we need. Maybe when the test comes, when the blizzard hits, when the conventional methods fail, that crazy idea will be the thing that saves us. Heinrich Mueller's stone wall furnace heated his home through a 10-day blizzard. It proved the skeptics wrong. It changed minds. It saved lives. And it reminds us that sometimes the fool is the only wise man in the room.